So Kevin brought it to my attention because I'm in a Mamsum Toti at the moment. That Hillel Bullman lost his father, the late Monty Bilchitz, and I know both of Hillel's parents, and he comes from a wonderful family, and on behalf of myself and Kevin, Phil Gavin Stoller, and Arthur Tenowitz, we wish you long life to you and your family. And Kevin's going to start by teaching us some ideas before I get into the Gemara share. Thank you, Kevin. Really, I really appreciate it.
Nice. Thank you, Damon, to dedicate it to wonderful man from a wonderful family. Okay, so just continue on the theme of davening. I found something here. When you daven for personal requests, it's in the Shema Kolenu bracha, and it's the first part before the actual final bracha. You can add your before you say Baruch Atah Hashem Shomea Tefillah. That's where you insert your personal prayers or requests, and it says how many requests can you make? It says here you can even make a request for the general public. You can make requests for others, as we know, for Panosa, for Shidduch, etc. As we said the other day, it's good to pray for others, to have others in mind. It makes us less self-absorbed, and so that's where you insert it here. And it says here, one who is praying and arousing mercy on behalf of another needs to mention his name in the prayer if he is not making the request in front of the person. So you've got to verbalize it, even though we do it silently. We say it silently to her. You've got to verbalize it. And then it says here, let's say someone has a parent. So it says you need to say the name. You need to actually physically mention it. It says, you don't say my father. You say Shlomo ben Eliezer, or whatever, let's say. He may say Haslocha with a certain thing, health or whatever. You actually mention the person by name, not my friend or my cousin. You actually got to mention the name specifically when including requesting something for them. Okay.
Okay.
Can I just ask the question, because you guys are experts? I always forget. If your parents, if you're a guy and your father's alive, then no, so it won't be in this case. But how does it work? Do you do it on the mother or the father's name? That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, that's for Refuah, you use the mother's name. There's a Shlomo ben.
For Refuah, you use the mother's name, yeah?
If it's for Refuah, yes. But if it's for normal, if normal request, you use the name, the standard name, which is Shlomo ben, the father's name, or that's it.
Who's alive?
Are you sure?
Yeah, who's alive, yes.
And if the father's
as
not
far
alive,
as I know, that's their name. For Refuah, you say,
very confused.
Correct me, no. For Refuah, you use the mother's name. But
the mother.
Ben or but, yeah. Like let's say this guy Shlomo, and his mother's name is Rivka. So if it's a Refuah, you say Shlomo ben Rivka. But if his normal name is, which is named after the son of the father, so Shlomo ben Eliyahu for in Shomea Tefillah. Unless you saying in Shomea Tefillah, because if you forget to say for Refuah, if you get to include it in the Refuah section of the Shmona Ezra, which is earlier, then you can say it before Shmona in the Shema Kolenu section before Shomea Tefillah.
Okay.
And then you mention it. So that's it. Refuah is mentioning the son of Ben the mother or Bat the mother.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Thank you. All right.
Am I right, Damon? That's what I know.
Yeah. We're on the 98th daf of Bava Kamma. And just as a summary, the Gemara discusses the law of damages with respect to coins. Rabba said, one who throws the coins of his fellow into the Great Sea or any ocean like the Mediterranean is not liable to pay for any damages. Now, even though the owner of those coins can't retrieve it on his own, and he will have to hire a professional diver to retrieve it, the person that knocked it out of his hands, whether he did it on purpose or by accident, isn't liable to pay for the coin, nor for the cost of the retrieval. Now, that was quite a difficult thing to learn, especially if it was on purpose. And the reason is, guys, if you remember, the Gemara explained that shortly after Rabba gave his explanation, it doesn't refer to whether the thrower took the coin and threw it into the sea, but whether he's actually struck the hand of the thrower, inverted commas. In other words, another guy had coins in his hand, and he hit his hand from below so that the coins were propelled in the water. Now, we're not talking about an accident here. It would seem as though the default position is if it was an accident, even then there's a shaila, but this seems to be on purpose. But the reason why he's not liable is, in order to be liable for theft, it has to firstly be direct damage instead of groma, which is causative or indirect damage. So in that particular way, there's no liability. Plus, the second factor depends on the clarity of the water. Because if the water is clear and the coin can be seen, the coin isn't considered lost or damaged. The owner's going to have to pay a diver to retrieve it, but that doesn't constitute what you call actual damage, but merely a retrieval cost. That's the way it's explained. Now, do I understand it? No. I think if somebody knocks it out of your hand on purpose, they should pay to retrieve it. But obviously the Gemara knows what it's doing, so I'd like to ask Rabbi Cohen where that's coming from. And basically it says, what's the reason? The Gemara says for the person that knocked the coins out of the owner of the coin's hand says, look, what you see lies before you. If you want it, take it. Meaning that the coin is right in front of you. It's not lost. I haven't damaged it. The water's not murky. However, the Gemara does state that it applies only when it's in clear waters because it's retrievable. But if it's in murky waters where it's not even visible, the thrower is then not free of liability. Why? Because since the coin can't be seen, it's considered lost. And it doesn't matter how many divers you get to see it, unless they're touching the coin, they're never going to actually retrieve it. And therefore, it's not causative damage because it's now stolen, in other words, it's disappeared. So Tosfot notes that the Gemara uses this case of clear water and murky water just as examples, because divers can generally retrieve the coin from clear waters, but not murky ones. So, guys, the bottom line is the critical factor is whether or not the coin can be retrieved. So the thrower is going to be liable if he throws the coins into clear water from, for example, a place where there's the Great Barrier Reef, where a person can't physically get in to get the coins, even if it's as clear as day. So it's about retrieval, okay? And what other factors are involved? And that applies only when he knocked the coin into the sea. So this position of knocking the coin is if he doesn't have his hand in the coin and he grabs the coins and he throws it. But if he merely knocked the owner's hand so that the coin was propelled into the sea, again, because it's not direct. Why? Because if he took the coin in his own hand and threw it into the sea, that's a direct damage, and he's considered to have stolen it. Why? Because in Leviticus, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 23, it obligates a robber to return the stolen article that he stole. It means he remains liable for the article until he returns it to the owner, because he directly took the coins of his own hand. Okay? Now, the Gemara is not 100%. Well, obviously, there's a required act to return the stolen monies from Vayikra. But the Gemara is not happy with Rabba's premise that a coin in the Great Sea can be retrieved only by davas. And that means it's not considered lost, because Rava challenged that ruling of Rabbah from the following price. He said, look, one may not deconsecrate Ma'aser Sheni on coins that are not in his possession. In other words, it physically has to be in his hand. How so? If he had coins in Kastera or in Hamelech, and basically what are those? Those are distant places to which it's not safe to travel, and caravans don't commonly travel. Why? Because you're going to end up getting robbed. So in that particular case, or if maybe you had a money wallet and it fell into the Great Sea, you can't deconsecrate Ma'aser Sheni on it. So what's he trying to prove? That so the Gemara takes for granted that the Brisa refers to where the wallet is recoverable from the sea. But say it had fallen into waters from which it can't be retrieved, then obviously you can't deconsecrate Ma'aser Sheni money on it. There'd be no need for the Brisa to teach that. So the whole point that it's bringing here is that coins or a wallet that are in the Mediterranean Sea, even though that they can be retrieved by divers because the water's clear, are considered lost. And why? Because you have to go through great expense or a heck of a lot of effort to get it back. And by the same token, throwing them into the sea should constitute an actual act of damage, which the thrower is liable to pay. Meaning, it doesn't have to be a case where he actually takes the coins out of the other person's hand. It's one thing to knock somebody's hand accidentally as you're expressing excitement over an issue, but if you do it on purpose, that's an actual act of damage, especially purposefully. So the Gemara answers that Rava said. What would his answer be? Because what Rava is trying to say to Rava is that if you can't deconsecrate Ma'aser Sheni into a case where coins fall into a difficult situation or dangerous situation to retrieve, then it means that you're liable for that on a theft basis. So Rava said in response to Rava, it's different with respect to the deconsecration of Ma'aser Sheni. Why? Because there the coins have to be readily accessible in your hand. That's according to the pasuk. For the merciful one said in his Torah, you shall bind the money in your hand. And where's that from? That's from Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 25. So there's an actual act of needing the money in your hand, whereas this, you're knocking money out of the third party's hand. And that principle is lacking here, because money that a person can't retrieve on his own, but only through davas, isn't considered accessible to him at the time. So in other words, you can only perform this act of deconsecration if you're saying a prayer or whatever, and you've got money in your hand. It's almost saying a kapora with the chicken above you for Yom Kippur, or alternatively having money in your hand and saying this tzedakah is representative of the chicken, and it would die for my sins, and the money shall be given to tzedakah. You have to have that physical act as part of the process of deconsecration of Ma'aser Sheni. So Rabbi is saying it's different here. That's part of a halachic process, and this is a case where it is retrievable. It's just doesn't have to be retrieved at the same point in time at which you deconsecrate, as far as deconsecration is concerned. So, by deconsecration, it's considered as if it's lost because you don't have the coins at the time when you're doing the particular enactment. So, at the same token, throwing them into the sea should still constitute a similar issue, but money isn't lost if you're able to get it back with a diver. That's basically what Rabba is saying to Rabba. They're not the same situation. So Rabba continues and says further, look, if we're on the subject of either causing somebody loss or damage and the degree of liability, if you have somebody that effaces the image of a coin of his fellow, he's not liable to pay for the damages. What do we mean? Which means you're basically hammering it until the surface is smooth like a stone, and you can't even see the image about which emperor is on the coin or which king So the image is no longer discernible, so it can't be seen as currency. So why is the guy that effaces the image on a coin not liable to pay for damages? Because even though the coin no longer passes as currency, it's and obviously in that case it's worth less than before. It's not worth less from a separate point of view, and that has to do with the fact that the silver content is the same. So since the silver content is the same, it still has value. It doesn't have value as currency, but if you melt down the silver in an ingot of silver, you can get the value. It's not like you've rendered it lost there. But you've got a different case with regards to where you're filing down the silver. Then the person that does that is liable because he diminishes the amount of silver that's in it. So if he beat it with a hammer and made it smooth as stone, there's no issue because he didn't diminish the silver content. And although it's not acceptable as currency, it's not considered an actual act of damage. Because an actual act of damage means that the silver dissipates. Now, that's only with regards to a coin. If you smash a utensil and the silver utensil has the same amount of silver, there you're liable because it's the utility of the actual usefulness of that particular implement that allows the function to take place, and therefore you've affected it because it's an actual use of an item destroyed. It's not a conceptual use of an item that is rendered, conceptually diminished. And therefore that's actual damage and not drama, which is causative or indirect damage. Okay? I'm just explaining to you what the Gemara says. So the guy, basically the effacer is not considered having physically damaged the coin, but he's basically just caused the owner the expense of having the coin re-stamped. So it's the same sort of analogy of throwing a coin into clear waters, where the owner's got to incur an expense of a retrieval by a professional diver. Now, the Gemara challenges Rabba's premise that hammering a coin doesn't constitute an actual act of damage as long as the coin remains physically intact. So Rabba challenged that ruling from the following brisa: if a master struck his slave upon his eye and blinded it, or upon his ear and deafened him, the slave goes free on account of those actions. Why? Because if you remember in Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 26 to 27, it says, if a man strikes the eye of his slave or the eye of his slave woman and destroys it, he shall set him free in the place of an eye. And if he strikes out the tooth of his servant or the tooth of his slave woman, he shall set them free in place of his tooth. So the Gemara in Kedushin, we did learn this 24a, derives that the law stated in both those verses isn't obviously necessarily specific only to a slave's eye teeth, but any limb that doesn't regenerate, even an ear. So we learned a case of if a master struck a wall and opposite the slave's eye and the slave no longer sees, or opposite his ear and he no longer hears, the slave doesn't go free on account of those actions. Do you remember why, guys, or you don't remember why?
That's indirect, yeah.
Exactly, it's grammar, it's indirect. And therefore, because the master didn't actually blind or deafen him, and it was affected by the slave's reaction to the sudden sound, and it's mainly causative in nature, or indirect. It's considered not that there was a blow to his body. Okay? So we're dealing with the same here of freedom from liability. So it's evident, guys, from the Brice's first ruling that causing an organ to cease functioning, that constitutes actual damage, even if the organ remains physically intact, but indirect is not. So what it's saying is this is going against Rabba's issue with effacing a coin. Because if you hammer and efface an image of the coin, it also constitutes actual damage to the coin, because you can see that even though that the coin remains physically intact in terms of the amount of silver, it actually changes physically. It happens to also change as far as the currency is concerned. And if you remember, if you looked at Rav Yehuda, he was saying that if a currency diminishes because it's no longer accepted by the monarchy, then that's the same thing as abstraction and non-liability for that. That when teruma becomes tameh, there's no liability because it's just a concept. It's not like the produce was actually damaged. In which case, Rav Yehuda turned around there and said, no, but if a coin was discontinued, you can physically see the change because the new coin has got a different embossing on it compared to the old coin. And therefore, the physical change of the coin, even though it manifests in an abstract concept, renders its actual physical change, which means the old coin gets accepted by the robber, and he has to reimburse the original owner for a coin that is provincially current or nationally current. So what it's saying is, if you use the same logic here, well, listen, you damage the currency, but you've also actually faced the coin itself, and there's physical damage. You can't have it both ways. That's Rabbah's challenge to Rabbah. So, whereas Rabbah said that at the end of the day, the silver content is the same. So Rabbah follows his opinion expressed elsewhere, and he says, look, it's not quite so simple, because if you're using this case of this indirect slave damage, it doesn't work like that, because if you look at Sanhedrin, Gavin and I learned this, and it's in Sanhedrin 85b, and it's based on Pasuk in Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 15. It says, one who strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. So obviously in Sanhedrin, Gavin and I learned that a son isn't liable to execution unless he wounded his parent. In other words, he caused either internal or external bleeding. So Rabbah is saying that if you strike one's father and make him deaf, you're liable to execution. And why is that? Because you've just made him deaf. Is because it's impossible to make somebody deaf without inflicting an internal wound. In other words, there must have been internal bleeding in the ear canal. Okay, and therefore, if you strike your slave and make him deaf, there must have been some sort of direct blow, even if it came through a interface of a wall or whatever the case may be. And that means it's physical damage, which means it's not groma, it's indirect or causative, it's direct. So the damage done to the ear is considered actual damage rather than causative, and that's why the slave goes free. So he's saying that Rabbah is saying to Rabbah, that's not a good analogy. And Rabbah said further, it's the same. If you nick the ear of the cow of this fellow, you're not liable to pay for damages. So what are we saying is, well, you have got an indirect loss. If you nick the cow of your fellow, then what happens is that animal is blemished. Not in terms of functionality to be able to be a working animal, but in terms of an altar offering. And therefore you've caused the person a problem. That's in Bechoros 37a. So the reason why you're not liable for that is because although the owner will have to buy another animal if his intention is to bring an offering, the reason why the damager is not liable to pay for the time and effort that will involve is because basically the cow stands as it did before. He did nothing to it, and not all oxen are destined to be sacrificed on the altar. In other words, you haven't made the animal unfit for working. You haven't even caused a major physical blemish to render the animal to sell less on the marketplace. And yes, the damager rendered the animal unfit for the altar, but the reason it doesn't affect the market value is because animals aren't generally bought for that purpose. They're bought in order to either eat or work. And if you haven't damaged it from either perspective, it's not deemed as general damage as to the reason why people buy animals. So for the time and effort the owner might have to spend in buying another animal, if he decides to bring an altar offering, that's his choice. Because most animals, firstly, are not eligible, nor do you have to bring that in terms of a sacrifice. So that's causative damage or indirect, In other words, the actual use of an animal is either to eat or to get it to work, and that hasn't been affected at all. So the Gemara is going to object to this on one particular example. I'll tell you what that is. So Rava says to Rabbah that if one who does work with purification water, what does it mean to work with purification water? He did work with water that was drawn to be consecrated as purification water. So, maybe use the water as a weight and measurement, and just measure a liter of water, which equals a kilogram, on a balancing scale. And purification water is used for a chata solution of water and ashes of a paraduma. But working it doesn't disqualify it for consecration with ashes. Now, all you've had to do there is that the person has to get more water. It's not the end of the world. But it's different with regards to the paraduma itself. Because if you're dealing with a chatas cow or with the paraduma itself, it invalidates them. Why? Because Kevin taught us a rule. I don't know if you remember, he was in South Africa at the time, that one of the requirements, it states in Numbers chapter 19, verse 2, is that the paraduma can only be a paraduma if there's no yoke has been mounted. Meaning, in Gemara Sota, we're going to cover this in the 46 daf we're doing with Simchas time, however, is that any sort of work that the paraduma does invalidates it for sacrifice. And therefore, you're dealing with a huge expense because paraduma is so valuable that that's the reason that you use it. It's got a specific, in other words, you can't replace it with another paraduma. There's an article, I remember learning, from Jewish guy. They came to him and they said to him, we want to buy this very, very expensive sapphire diamond from you. And he said, I can't give it to you. He said, why? He said, my father's sleeping. And it's under his pillow. He keeps it under his pillow because he wants to make sure it doesn't get stolen. And he's sleeping and I don't want to wake him up. Okay? So I can't sell it to you. And they say, well, if you lose out in the sale, you lose out. Anyway, he didn't want to disturb his father. So as reward, he actually had born unto him a paraduma, which he sold to the Jewish people and made a fortune of money. So he was rewarded for the fact that he had kibbud avayim. The only slant that I didn't like on that particular drosha was what Ralph Goldschmidt said. That said that basically the Goyish nations, when they do something good, they get rewarded in this world. And I really didn't like that particular sentiment. He said that proves it. Maybe the person still had reward for kibbud avayim in the next world and got this as an added benefit. I'm just not mad about those sort of shurim. That like they do something good and it's always done with an intent where it's for this world, and that's automatically assumed. So that was the only part of the shur that irritated me. But the point of it, Kevin, is that you brought up this case of how rare paraduma was. You taught us once. And the fact of it is, to render it unicate, that's serious damage because it happens once every generation. You've got a paraduma to get rid of the tumor from a dead body. And therefore, there's complete liability. It's not that you can replace it with another animal with inconvenience. Do you get what I'm saying? So, what the Gemara is basically saying there is that's an exception to the general rule. So, it says with the paraduma itself, it's not liable under the laws of man, but is liable under the laws of heaven. Now, not everybody agrees because that implies that although working with purification water or chatas cow disqualifies it for purification processes, it's only through work where the disqualification is indiscernible that is not liable under the laws of man. So what he's saying is that if you actually damage the animal physically, and that's actual damage, there you're liable with a legal case. But if you just work the animal, you can't see if an animal's been worked. So it's like having something impure touch the truma, or having something that's kosher rendered unkosher by lying on seafood or whatever the case may be, it's not a quantifiable damage, and therefore you're not liable under the laws of man. It's only if you nick the animal's ear, or you can see that the disqualification is discernible. And there is an opinion that if there's no physical change, or it's just working the animal, that there's no liability under the law of man, I mean the laws of heaven. Not everybody agrees with that. Because okay, it is this opinion, but not everybody agrees in that. But according to the Gemara, in the case of one who nicks an ear of a cow, where disqualification is discernible, you're liable under the laws of man as well. So the Gemara says, in fact, even one who nicks an ear, you're not liable to pay, even if it invalidates water for purification purposes or the animal for an altar offering, with a discernible disqualification. You're not liable under the laws of man. Why? Because the damage is minor. That's not the purpose of an animal, but it's different with the chatas offering of a paraduma. Okay. So where the damage is indiscernible, you're liable under the laws of heaven. Rabba continues and said further, and we're going to talk next time about loan documents, etc. So, all right, guys, I wanted to thank you very much. There's about 6 minutes left, but I didn't know if we wanted to go through a whole lot of other issues or not. In fact,
can I just ask something? Sorry, I'll carry on.
Yeah, you can, sure.
You were talking about the certain types of damage to a slave allows him or her to go free. Did you say, and I may have lost you for about a minute there, did you mention the part where the slave refuses to go free after the Shemitah year of the 7-year cycle, and they knock a hole in his ear with the door handle? Did you mention that?
No, because the issue wasn't about him refusing to go free. The issue was what's considered grounds upon which you can allow him to go free or not. But
based on the damage, yeah.
Yeah, but you can explain it to the group with pleasure. It is interesting that with pleasure you can explain.
So if a slave, okay, just correct, Damon, you must correct me if I'm wrong, because as Gavin and Arthur and I, we have knowledge, but we not on your level. But
No,
anyway, so if a slave, at the Shemitah year, many things. Well, we just had the Shemitah year. Which ended at Rosh Hashanah, right just past Rosh Hashanah, the Shemitah year ended, and certain debts are forsaken, certain things are, and one of the things is that I think slaves can go free. If they refuse to go free, it means they actually don't want to leave servitude, and it's not a good thing for anybody to be in servitude or literally a slave to someone. It can't be a permanent solution. Can't live their life the whole way like that. So if a person has got it so good as serving a Jewish master and doesn't want to leave, they can, in the lobe of the ear, they put the slave next to the door, next to the handle, and they whack and they push the door. I think it's the earlobe, and they make a hole. It's to teach that maybe it could be a sign that the slave is actually, the person doesn't want to be free in his or her life, and they want to. So that's a sign that they don't really respect freedom, I think. Is that true, Damon?
Yeah. So
sounds a bit eerie to me.
Yeah, totally. Yes. Okay. Did you hear what I said, Gavin?
Yes. I think we're trying to destroy this whole concept.
Yeah.
There were a few good puns. Kevin, you're 100% correct. Thanks. And then on the Yovel year, on the 50th, I think he has to go free. I think he has a choice. Am I right, Damon? You remember that one?
Yeah. So there's a difference between the Shemitah year and the Yovel year. If you have a look where it talks about this, Devarim chapter 15, verse 12, if you look it up. what that time period is, because he's basically pierced through the ear with an awl, and because he didn't listen. Listening was to serve Hashem, not to serve man. Guys, your source of it is Shemot chapter 21, verse 5 to 6, and Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 16 to 17. So you can have a look at it there. Because basically, it's if you look on the 25th chapter of Vayikra, it talks about there's a unique case where it's not freed in the 7th year, but rather in the 50th year. So there, as Gavin said rightly, it's an issue. And why was the objection? Because it said, "For my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, they shall not be sold as bondsmen, not slaves." You get what I'm saying? So that's in the 25th chapter of Leviticus. I don't know where about in the 25th chapter, but it's there. You can't be sold as bondsmen. So, when that person chooses that sort of servitude, that's where the problem is.